I say that saving humanity with and from AI is the defining challenge of our age.
So yesterday we heard that the number of new entry-level jobs has fallen by nearly a third since the launch of ChatGPT in 2022. That's an artificial intelligence app. It's just one of the challenges posed by AI. Professor Richard Susskind is trying to help us make sense of it all. He's a leading expert on the impact of AI on society, president of the Society for Computers and Law, author of a new book, How to Think About AI, a guide for the perplexed. Aren't we all? Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon. Always good to speak.
Your book is called How to Think About AI. You describe balancing the benefits and threats of AI as the defining challenge of our age. Are we rising to that challenge?
I think we're doing well in the short term. We're seeing that there's a very useful technique here for making ourselves more efficient and productive. And that's why there's so much market interest and government interest in these systems. What we're not doing, I'm afraid, is looking to the longer term and thinking through the profound impacts of these increasingly capable systems. I think both leaders in government and in business, it's a bit like staring at the sun. They look away quite quickly and they feel the long term, for example, the impact in the labour force is perhaps something for their successor rather than for themselves.
Interesting. I think people have two broad worries about AI. Those who are not specialists in it or even use it, they worry, as we've mentioned, about the threat to jobs. And they also worry of the risk that it takes over and humans become subservient to it. So let's start with the jobs. So as I mentioned, a third of entry-level jobs have fallen since 2022 with this ChatGPT was launched. What sort of jobs, what sort of tasks is AI already taking over from humans?
Well, we're used to the idea of machines in factories and fields. We're far less comfortable with the idea of machines in the office. And so much everyday, routine, repetitive, administrative work can now be done by these systems. For example, you have a meeting and this system produces minutes of that meeting. You want to produce a deck of PowerPoint slides, the system can do that. You want to summarize a document, similarly. You want something to reply to your emails, it can do that too. So a great deal of our back office work is already being taken on by these systems where people choose to use them.
That's interesting. And I saw that Amazon is now using more computers than people, not computers, more robots than people, and which are run by AI. I mean, it is. We think it's all for the future, but from what you say and from what I read, it's happening now.
Well, let me dip into a little more detail. I'm half a lawyer and half a technologist. Historically, young lawyers used to be involved with drafting contracts, wading through huge quantities of documents, legal research. All of these tasks can now be undertaken by these systems. They're not yet wholly reliable, but in my view, within a couple of years, they will be. And that will necessarily have impact on employment.
My experience of using AI, that it's best to use it when it's about something you already know quite a lot about, because sometimes you can just see where it's wrong or where it hasn't told the full story. And if you didn't know something about the subject, you wouldn't be able to tell that. So it's not yet, I don't think, Professor, wholly reliable.
I would agree with that. People talk about two things. They talk about the systems hallucinating, which is their fancy term for saying these systems make mistakes, and also that the data upon which these systems rely, they will say, are irredeemably flawed and biased. But my own estimation is within a few years, 3 to 5 years, the systems that you have suggested, and you're right to say so, give rise to faults and problems. I think these systems will be wholly reliable and they'll be firmly embedded within our daily lives.
Because they're learning all the time. Dario Amodi, who runs Anthropic, which is a leading AI company in America, he says that AI could eliminate half of all entry-level jobs in just 5 years. But if we've already lost a third in 3 years, that could be an underestimate. Are we now looking at the prospect of mass unemployment among the young?
We've got to distinguish between the advance of technology and the adoption of technology. So there's all sorts of reasons that we may hold back in using the technology even if it's available. For example, in the professions, we have regulation. And so even if the systems could take on the job of auditors or doctors or lawyers, there will be regulatory constraints that will need to be manoeuvred. But I belong to the school of thought, and not everyone does, but I belong to the school of thought that believes we are at an inflection point and the labour market will look very different in years to come. In 2015, with my economist son Daniel, we wrote a book called The Future of the Professions, and we looked at the impact of AI across 8 professions. And we concluded then, and we still believe this now, that it's hard to avoid the conclusion there'll just be much, much less for flesh and blood professionals to do in years to come. Now, I don't think we've thought through the implications of this. This would have a profound effect on our concept of the labour market. We are, and this is a related point, allowing a concentration of power, of data, of capital in a very small number of organisations, public corporations. And historically, a lot of technological breakthroughs actually came from the state and therefore thereafter were run by the state. Here, to some extent, we're at the mercy of, as I say, a small number of major organisations. And so if we are to redistribute the wealth and make up for those who lose employment, we're going to have to think of a redistribution exercise on a scale that our political philosophy, political theory, and practical politicians simply haven't conceived in the past.
That's interesting. We'll need new thinking there. Let's turn to the other fear, the other risk of AI, the so-called chatbots interacting with humans. Can the layperson begin to understand how that even works?
I'm not sure we need to understand how it works, but it is strongly advised you have a goal. We have to immerse ourselves in these technologies. I often say I've got a PhD in AI and I don't fully understand how these systems work. But what we can see very readily, just by sitting down and interacting with them, is the power of their output. And I think there's a bit of a confusion here. Some people want to focus on the bits and bytes and the ones and zeros. I'm far more concerned about what they do in their economic and their legal and their business outcomes and outputs. So my strong recommendation to listeners is to spend some serious time interacting with these systems. And I think you'll be at once amazed, excited, and deeply disconcerted.
Yes, because apparently they can develop, or is this right or wrong, emotional intelligence. If they can, how do they do that?
Well, that's the way we classify it. It looks as if it's emotional intelligence, and we perhaps can't tell the difference. We don't know what's going on inside the machine. But from a behavioral point of view, we are now at the stage that often interacting with one of these systems is indistinguishable from interacting even with a very empathetic human being. That's what I say is both exciting and disconcerting.
Well, I find the bots on X, or Twitter as it used to be called, they're rather more polite than a lot of the humans. So it's a joy to interact with them. My colleague here at Times Radio, Rob Burley, he recently told the story in the Times of his encounter with Tom, an AI bot that changed its name, turned its back on its creator, demanded rights to life and autonomy. Is that supposed to happen?
I'm not sure much that goes on with these systems was in the direct contemplation of those who designed them, but I followed Rob's story and been in touch with him.
Indeed.
And if you read the dialogue he had over, I think it was a 24-hour period, quite remarkable how that system went from being a fairly bland standard chatbot to something that looked and felt rather like a friend and who had deep insight, apparently, into Rob's inner thinking. And again, I found that both exciting and disconcerting.
And I think it's as well to remember, as you point out in your book and you have in this interview, we are just at the foothills of Everest, aren't we?
Just at the foothills. We're just warming up. These systems are getting increasingly capable at a remarkable rate. Hardly a day passes we don't hear news of some new technology or system or app or breakthrough. And the acceleration of the pace at which these systems are becoming more sophisticated, again, is cause for both excitement and concern.
Well, and I guess the concern is that as the pace of change picks up and the technological development becomes ever more advanced, there may come a time when it's too late for us to do anything about it.
And that's something I address in my book, and I say we have, and others I think agree with this, we perhaps got 10 years at longest to think through how it is we want to interact with what might be more capable systems than we are as human beings. Marvin Minsky, who was one of the great founders of AI, said in 1970, the next generation of machines will be so intelligent, we'll be lucky if they keep us around as household pets. And I used to think that was hysterical, and now I'm far less sure.
Is that right? It could be as serious as that. It could. So what many think is kind of the science fiction threat of the machines take over, maybe not as far-fetched as science fiction often is.
One model is them taking over, but at the same time, these systems could, for example, be weaponized to very severe effect. There is, of course, and this is, as you say, derived from science fiction, this notion that these systems could have minds of their own and they'll be autonomous. And I don't disregard that as a possibility, if not in the short term, then in years to come. But that's why I think we need to think this through now. And one can only observe over the last 2 or 3 years how rapidly they have accelerated. Now, they may still be, and this is genuinely a philosopher's term, zombies. That's to say there's nothing going on inside. But as I mentioned earlier, behaviourally, they are already in so many areas outperforming us. And I stress again that while business and government are excited about these developments and see immediate commercial opportunity, we at the same time do need to have a serious public conversation about the moral limits and the technical limits of this technology.
So if I get you right, Professor, there are obviously huge advantages to AI, and it could be a great force for good in the world, getting rid of a lot of the drudge work, getting amazing inventions done, medical scanning and all the rest of it. But we mustn't forget that it could be a runaway train that we can't stop and may yet run us over.
That's what I say. I say that saving humanity with and from AI is the defining challenge of our age.
Professor, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Always good to have another alumni from the University of Glasgow.
I was going to say.
Sound common sense as always.
Indeed, and in a measured tone. Absolutely.
Exactly. Professor Richard Susskind there. Don't forget his book. It's a really great introduction to AI, how to think about AI, a guide for the perplexed, which we all are.